Okay, so we have now started, and I can see people are joining, so that's good. Um, so yeah, welcome to defining the undefined. What is TSU Part 4? We're gonna give people a couple of minutes to join. And for those of you that are on point and have already joined, we have a couple of things that we can entertain you with while we're waiting. So we started doing a couple of things at SpecTops, and one of the things are that we are now doing a monthly webinar for BloodHound, where we are talking about like what we have introduced in BloodHound and yeah, latest features, also like latest tradecraft that are relevant to BloodHound. So yesterday we did the first version of that webinar, and we had Matt Creel on the webinar demoing BloodHound, which is a tool that he has made to yeah, help get data into BloodHound that you can collect using buffs. So a more stealthy way for red teamers to collect data and get it into BloodHound. But yeah, you can watch the recording of yesterday's webinar through the link that's on the top of this page here. Then we're also starting to do like an on-site in-person conference every year, and this year it's going to be in Washington D.C. in the spring. Tomorrow is the last day that's open for a call for presenters. So if you have any ideas for a talk, then yeah, this is your last chance for submitting your talk. It's yeah, we did it for the first time last year, and it was a lot of fun. So I definitely recommend to submit a talk. SpecOps will also pay for your travel to the destination and your stay there, and they will also sponsor a training of SpecOps on site. So a lot of great benefits of attending and yeah, talking at SoCon. So hope you will consider that. So I think we are already 2 minutes past the hour. So I think we can probably get started with today's webinar, which is yeah, part 4 of what is tier 0. Oh yeah, before we begin, there's a couple of housekeeping items I need to mention. First of all, this presentation is recorded, and you'll be able to watch the recording of this presentation using the same link you used to join this call here. The slides will also be uploaded to our GitHub. I'm sure one of the guys can send the link to that in the chat, and if not, then I can do it later. We also have a Q&A feature here in Zoom where you can submit questions. Hope you will do that. We'll try to answer the questions either like during the presentation here, or else we'll take it at the end. So who are we? Martin, do you want to go first and introduce yourself?
Sure. Yes, thank you. And so I'm Martin. I'm in Copenhagen, very close to Jonas actually, physically. Technical account manager for the BloodHound Enterprise customers. So it means anyone who buys BloodHound Enterprise, I'll be their one-on-one technical contact. I don't want to do all the other stuff that we also deal with, which is sales and so on. And yeah, I'll talk a tiny bit more about what I do with the customers, and that's actually my focus of today. Yeah.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Lee Chagoya Christensen. I'm a security researcher here at SpectreOps, which means I'm responsible for identifying kind of new tradecraft, new attack paths that we can use either on our assessments, so when we're doing penetration tests and red teams, or new attack paths that we could bring into BloodHound. I have a kind of an application security and pen testing and red teaming background. And so I've been doing that for, I don't know, over 10 years now. So that's kind of been my roots. But now I get the opportunity to just, study new ways to attack environments now and see if we can build that into the product and help protect people.
Cool. So yeah, my name is Jonas, and I work as a product architect at SpectraOps. So my role is mainly to look at the existing tradecraft and figure out like how we can get these like attack vectors for Active Directory and Intra ID into to BloodHound. So working a bit closer to the product, but yeah, that's my role. So today we have a couple of things that we want to go over, but first we'll do a recap to talk about like what we have covered in this this series so far. Then we have a couple of community contributions that were submitted to the tier 0 table on GitHub. So we will go over that before we dive into insights from working with BloodHound Enterprise customers, which is Martin's presentation. It's going to be exciting. And then we will dive into Microsoft Exchange on-prem and figure out if Exchange should be tier 0 or not. At last, we have ADCS, Active Directory Certificate Services, where we're also going to look into which components should be tier 0 of ADCS. First is the recap. So yeah, this is part 4 of this series. So we have already done 1, 2, and 3. And in the first episode, we made a definition of tier 0. So our own definition of tier 0. And I'm just going to read it up here. And our definition is that tier 0 is a set of assets in control of enterprise identities and their security dependencies. So the most essential part of tier 0 in Active Directory is like domain admins and the domain controllers, because they control like all the enterprise identities. So that's an example of that. Then we have defined control as a relationship that can contribute to compromising the control asset or impact its operability. So control could, for example, be that you have force change password on a domain admin, so you can reset the password of a domain admin and log in as the domain admin and take over the control of the domain admin account. But it could also be another kind of relationship, like delete permissions on the domain admin, which will then impact its its ability to operate. So that's also control in our definition. Security dependencies are components whose security impact other components' security. So what we mean by that is like there are sometimes more than one factor that's required, or more than one thing that's required to control something or impact like security of tier 0. One example could be that if you have like an admin account that is required to use MFA wherever they are logging into systems, then the password of the account and then this other factor, they're both like security dependencies. So even through that, you cannot take over the account by resetting the account's password, because you still don't have the second factor. Then that's still like a tiering violation, because the password is a security dependency for the account. Then after creating the definition, we went through Microsoft's original list of tier 0 AD groups and discussed whether or not they should be tier 0 or not by our definition. And we put them in this tier 0 table, which is on GitHub. In part 2, we discussed more on-premise AD objects. And part 3 was intra-ID admin roles. We didn't cover all intra-ID admin roles, but just a couple of them, just to give you an idea of how you can use the same arguments that we use for on-premise AD also in intra. So to community contributions, DNS admins was suggested. So DNS admins is an on-premise AD group which can control DNS in the environment. There used to be an attack which allowed you to load basically any DLL on domain controllers if they were hosting DNS. At least that's my understanding. And then this DLL would be executed as system. I'm sure, Lee, you can correct me if I'm wrong. You've probably executed that attack. But to my understanding, this thing has been patched. so it's no longer possible. But still, DNS admin controls DNS, and that means that you can potentially enable relay attacks even over Kerberos, because Kerberos rely on DNS. And you can also disrupt tier 0 operation, because if you control DNS, which Kerberos rely on, you can also prevent tier 0 admins from being able to use Kerberos. So therefore, it should also be tier 0. Then performance logger users and distributed COM users were suggested. We already had distributed COM users in the table, but there was a new attack that manifested why it should be in the table as tier 0 objects. So these two groups here, they have permissions to activate DCOM on DCs. More specifically, they can abuse these permissions to compromise users logged into DCs through a coerce and NTLM relay attack. And Andrea Perini has written a really great blog post about how you can abuse these groups. And he was also the one that suggested these groups. So yeah, we have added these 3 groups to the table, or these 2 new ones, and one of them was already there. But yeah, thanks a lot to the persons that have submitted these things. If you have anything that we haven't covered yet, or you think that we are wrong about, then please let us know and submit a pull request or open an issue on the GitHub repo. So Martin, I'm gonna approve that you take over the control of my computer. So now you should be able to go through your slides. Are you muted?
Yeah.
Of course, always. So thank you, and thank you to the community contributors. So I'll talking about isolating tier 0. We all talking about what is tier 0 and so on. But also our BloodHound Enterprise customers, they are working on isolating that. And I clicked. There we go. So to start off by saying who are our customers, I can say that tiering is for everyone, small to large. Usually smaller customers, they have no tiering when they're coming in to use BloodHound Enterprise. And larger customers, they'll end up having a full-scale tiering deployment, multiple tiers, and so on. So my job as a TAM is to provide this BloodHound power user to the customers, but also give them tiering guidance. So it's a lot of my focus is actually helping them do tiering, and that's why I have these insights for you. So these are the challenges I'll go through today. So it's insights on these different challenges. I won't spend time reading the table or the points. First one is stakeholder investment. And this is the most important thing you can get when you need tiering. We see it as at some customers, they have stakeholder investment all the way. And at others, it's only the security team who is talking about tiering. If you don't have stakeholder investment, you can't do tiering because it is a significant effort. That's it. Forget all the technical implementations if you don't have it. So the whole organization basically must think in graphs. That's top-level support. And if they like it, tie tiering into a security policy and collaborate across teams. The strongest customers and the strongest tiering I've seen implemented is when these 2 things, or 3 things, however many it is, are in place. So how can you achieve this? Maybe some of you are just security people who dreams of tiering, but don't have it. You would need to sell the concept of tiering. Obviously. So I think here you can ask yourself, what does every pen test that you've seen internally show? And it probably shows there's a path to domain admins where there shouldn't be a path. If you don't have such a pen test, assess your own tier 0 attack paths. And you will find something. And when it comes to convincing the top management or whoever of implementing tiering, you can just start by implementing tier 0, which is just the focus of this webinar anyway. So you should have all the resources available. Next up, after you have your top level support and all this stuff and collaboration, you would need to classify your tier 0. Now, Jonas talked about our definition. You have that. Now you need to make your definition of tier 0, because it is a bit dependent on the organization. But luckily, tools like BloodHound, they do the work for you. For example, in BloodHound, anyone who's a member of a group that is tier 0 also becomes tier 0. A GPO becomes tier 0 if it applies to a tier 0 object. So we have certain rules within the product that helps you make your own classification. Secondly, when you've gotten this initial definition, you need to audit those memberships. Many times with customers, we see them on board, we see them having the automatic definitions made. And then I'm the one to ask, why is this user account member of domain admins or some form of tier 0? And the name is, firewall LDAP user. Like, it's literally just used for looking up who is member of certain AD groups, and you've given it tier 0 access. So get those out. That is the first place to start. Next up, we go to identifying the violations. So you found you made the definition, you made your very secure group. Now you need to find out who is having control of this group, who is not supposed to have that. Here is data from a very small, not very small, but small customer of BloodHound Enterprise, 10,000 users, 3,000 computers. It's not that many assets, but when you look at the number of relationships, it's over 600,000 relationships. Now, you're going to have to ask yourself the question, which of these many relationships are tiering violations? And you're going to find that you do have violations. And I write here that all our onboarded customers have violations. And that is true, no matter the size and no matter the number of tiers and organizational support and so on, there will be violations. It's inevitable. And here you again need to not think as technical people as much, but more in strategic ways. You need to do this attack path management terminology, where you need to handle the attack paths in a smart way. And using the graph or using BloodHound, you can solve the problem using these tools. So after you've identified however many violations that you have, you also want to quantify the risk, and you also want to know your unknowns. To this, we see with the customers that the more we increase the visibility into the graph, the more we also increase the known risk. That's a good example here on the right side, where on the bottom picture, you may know BloodHound, it can collect who is logging on where. In this customer environment, we see that the percentage of users we've seen logging in, suddenly our completeness dropped to 0. So I think it was a bug, made us not have this visibility anymore. And we could directly correlate that into the risk picture we saw at the customer, that suddenly all the risks were gone. Cool, but we can see why this happened. It's because we're lacking data. And as soon as the data came back up again on the bottom right side, so did the risk. And it's seen many places. I've seen it over and over again. If I see this big drop, I will immediately go back in and check, okay, is there something wrong with the data? maybe I don't want to say most times. I trust in our customers, but I've seen it enough times. Yeah, and data types, there are many types. There are sessions, there are local groups, UAs, registry stuff, and so on. And you also need to ask yourself, again, what are your unknowns? Where are my DC backups? If they are on, whatever system, BloodHound can see where they are stored. You need to classify that as tier 0 yourself, and you also need to assess attack paths to it. So again, it's coming into knowing your unknowns. Some of them you can do something about, for example, collecting the sessions, and other things, unfortunately, you can't do yet. But yeah. So coming into my last slide is that you also need a usable tiering implementation. And you also need this continuous audit. Sorry, reading too much. You also need to do the continuous audit of your tiering implementation. And there's this famous quote, security at the expense of usability comes at the expense of security. So what does it mean? Well, an example could be in security, you would do a logon restriction. Now, this comes at the expense of usability because we know admins, they suddenly can't log on where they want to do anymore. And then the second part of the quote comes at the expense of security, means it will cost you some security. For example, the admin will create an exception and then they'll log in somewhere. And this is exactly what I saw last week, is that an admin actually created an exception to these logon restrictions because there was a usability problem. And they logged in at a very stupid, security stupid point. And because we had the BloodHound Enterprise that keeps auditing this risk, we also saw that this was a very bad place to log in. The domain users had the control of this, and the risk went through the roof. So implement tiering with usability. And luckily, our industry has changed a bit. We have more usability within implementations, but also new risks. For example, here is that PAM. It can rotate your passwords for you. Great. You don't have to do that manually anymore. But now your PAM is also tier 0. Your PAM also adds complexity. Again, you have more MFA as other controls. As Jonas said, MFA is now a security dependency. You're gonna have to also make that into your tier 0. So your tier 0 picture basically evolves as you're doing implementation, and your need for auditing also increases. Last thing I want to say is that when you're talking to top level, you also have to sometimes stop being the strict security person as I don't know, I can be sometimes. We need pause. Like, yeah, but sometimes, we can't have 3 laptops, one for each of our tiers and so on. Sometimes you just have to accept the risk. So you can accept there's a violation of clean source, and you can reduce risk with MFA. Now, you're just going to get more risks now. And also, as I just said, you're going to have maybe an increased tier 0 classification. So yeah, all of these insights are kind of grabbed out from the things I've learned at customers. This has been 1.5 years now. And they don't seem to go away. And it's, yeah, hopefully this helps you implementing or isolating tier 0. Cool.
Cool. Thanks a lot for sharing your insights, Martin. That was super cool. Yeah, I definitely think that you're right about all the things that you say, and yeah, it's a process to isolate tier 0, and yeah, I think you're right that it's sometimes also a matter of like looking at the bigger picture of the risk and determine like which of the problems are the biggest ones that you can fix first, or you should fix first. I think that's a really good point. And sometimes you have to accept risk, at least to begin with, until you're more mature and ready to take on more advanced problems. So that was super cool. So the next topic is Microsoft Exchange on-prem. So what is that thing? It's an on-prem or hybrid solution for communication. At least that was the definition when I looked it up on I can't remember if it was like Microsoft's documentation or I asked ChatGPT. It's a system for email, calendar, contacts, and tasks. So if you're used to using Outlook, then all the stuff that you have in Outlook, basically. I don't think it should be a tier 0 dependency by like just the nature of the system. Like tier 0 should not depend on emailing and calendar and so on to be able to operate. I've seen some organizations that have been using like emails for their tier 0 accounts and made like workflows that required that tier 0 admins received emails on their tier 0 account, and had this like dependency on emailing. I think in general you should try to avoid that. So like having as few systems that you need to classify as tier 0. So to reduce the attack surface of tier 0. But if you agree on that, then like the next questions, or the big question is, does it have like control over tier 0? Because if that's the case, then we need to classify it as tier 0, right? Unless we can actually do something about that control. So in order to answer that question, we need to understand what are the components of Exchange, and do these components have tier 0 control? First, let's look at this beautiful architecture that I found online. This is like an Exchange environment here, and the key components are these mailbox servers. That's like the Exchange servers that hold all the emails, and the servers that you connect to through Outlook to load your emails and send emails and so on, see your calendar and stuff like that. That's like located in the internal network, and these mailbox servers here, they're joined to Active Directory. Typically, there was also a need for employees to connect to these mailbox servers over the internet. Because you also want to be able to connect to a mailbox when you're just joined to your Wi-Fi at home, for example, and so on. At last, we also need some kind of connection to the internet in order to send emails and receive emails from other organizations. You're likely not going to use Exchange only for emailing your colleagues. And also, if it's a hybrid environment, then it also needs to have some kind of connection. And that goes through this Edge transport server, which is also part of like the Exchange deployment. We're going to focus on the mailbox servers because these are AD joined, and we're just going to refer to them as Exchange servers. The reason why we want to focus on those are like if they are AD objects, then they can have permissions in AD, so potentially have the privilege to take over control over tier 0. So we have these Exchange servers, the mailbox servers. Then there's also a bunch of AD groups that Exchange will create when you deploy it. So we also need to look into what these AD groups here can do in Active Directory. So in order to answer the question of what permissions do the components have in AD, we need to dive into the 3 different models of Exchange. There are these 3 different permission models. There's a shared permission model, which is the default one that most organizations have. Then there is a role-based access control split permission model, RBAC split permission model. And then there's the AD split permission model. So it's like a configuration thing that you can specify when you install Exchange, and you can also later change the configuration to use one of the other models. So our approach has been to deploy each model and then audit the permissions in AD to see if there's any Exchange objects that could like control anything that we classify as tier 0. For the shared permission model, start with a BloodHound analysis. And we quickly saw that this Exchange Windows permissions group has a lot of outbound control. It turns out that it has this ACE on the domain, or ACEs, multiple permissions. One granting force change password on users, and another granting write daggle on users. And then on groups, it has add member, which means that it can control membership of groups. And this permission is set on the domain head objects with inheritance enabled. So that means that all the users and groups in the Active Directory will inherit that permission unless they are protected against inherited permissions. So domain admins and enterprise admins and so on, these like protected groups, they're protected by admin ST holder, which has ACL inheritance disabled. So that means that they will not inherit this permission. So by default, there's no path directly to domain admins. But what we typically see is that not all tier 0 objects are protected by admin ST holder. A very common attack path that we see in many environments is this one here. And that is, the group Exchange Windows permission has these edges here to a service account. So that's the ADSync, or no, it's not ADSync, Intra ID Connect account that's used for connecting AD to Intra ID, which has DC sync privileges. And just having these DC sync privileges does not make it protected by admin ST holder. So unless unless somebody clicked on that object and went in and disabled ACL inheritance, then it will inherit the permissions from the domain. So that's a very common attack path. But there's typically also other tier 0 systems which are also not controlled or not protected with ACL inheritance disabled. So I think it's fair to say that in general there are like attack paths in default in environments. So the next question is then, who can control this Exchange Windows permissions group? So we have the group here, and that's our privileged group. And if we look on inbound object control in BloodHound, then we will see that this other Exchange group called Organization Management has generic all on the computer on this object, so full control. And then there's a user which is member of that group, and that is my Exchange admin. So this group is for the Exchange admins. Then we also have this other group called Exchange Trusted Subsystem, which has membership of the first group, and it also has the permission to add new members to the group. And it also has one member, and in my lab environment, that's my Exchange server. So Exchange servers will be member of this other group here by default. So that means that Exchange admins and Exchange servers, they have like a path to this group here, and they can then, compromise tier 0. Next up, we want to figure out like who can then control these other groups here. And that's very simple. They can control each other. So that makes it a bit more simple, because then we only have to worry about, these 3 groups here and their members. So we saw that this Exchange Windows permissions group, it has control over tier 0, and then we have these indirect controllers as well. So for the shared permission model, we can say that like it's not a tier 0 security dependency, but it does have tier 0 control. I think it's also important to mention that this control here could potentially be removed or remediated. It is possible to disable ACL inheritance from the domain on tier 0 objects. We do see customers that are doing that. One way you can do it is to create an OU with all your tier 0 assets and then deny ACL inheritance from the domain. And that will effectively solve this problem. So as long as you you do that and you make sure to get all your tier 0 assets into that OU, then then you should be good. And also, it shouldn't be necessary for Exchange to have these permissions on your tier 0 stuff, because it's not like a service account that has tier 0 permissions needs to have emailing enabled. And the same for an admin group for a tier 0 system that grants local admin on, let's say, PKI. There's no reason that Exchange should be able to control membership of that group. So it should be feasible. So now we have looked at the shared permission model, and then we can dive into the RPAC split model. So it is the recommended model by Microsoft, and it provides some better options for delegating limited control in Exchange RBAC. So Exchange has like its own system that it used to figure out like who in Exchange can actually perform what permissions. So it's like another like layer on top of Active Directory. But if we look at the AD permissions, it's basically the same as the shared model. So yeah, it turns out that this like split permission that it refers to by the name, it is in Exchange RBAC, which you can almost also tell by the name of the model. But yeah, from our perspective, it means that the attack paths are basically identical for both the shared permission model and also the RBAC split model. And that leads us to this slide here. So we can now say that, yeah, it's basically the same as the shared model. Next up is the AD split permission model. And it looks a bit more promising, because if we look at it from a BloodHound perspective, we can see that there's no outbound control now from this Exchange Windows permissions group. So with this model, Exchange has way more limited write access in Active Directory. So that's good. There is an admin challenge though, and that is to grant the necessary permissions in AD, because Exchange have the need to write to some attributes. And for example, if you're creating like mailbox accounts and groups and all this stuff that are necessary for emailing to work, I know very little about all that. Then you will have to grant these permissions manually. There's a blog post by Teal that goes into that and explains how you can set up some of these permissions. And there's a link to that blog post in the bottom of the slide. But yeah, it looks more promising. But unfortunately, BloodHound does not capture everything. I hate to admit it, but that is the truth. So if we take a closer look at what these Exchange groups can do, we can see that Exchange Trusted Subsystem has write access to the public information property set on users. So there's an ACE configured on the domain that grants it this right here. And again, it's with inheritance enabled. And this property set here, public information, it includes the alt security identities attribute. Write access to that attribute means that you can perform an escalation 14 scenario A attack, which essentially just allows you to take over the control of that account using a certificate that you can map on the user, and then you can authenticate as the user. The ACE that we have here in the screenshot, you can see like in the bottom, then there's an allow permission that is set for this property set, and it has inheritance enabled. But then there's also a deny permission, and that denies write access to this specific attribute, but it's only set for computers. So that means that this group here cannot compromise computers, but all other objects that have this property, which users have, this group is enabled to compromise those by writing to this attribute. So that brings us to this slide here, that we can say that, yeah, it's basically the same for the AD split model. It's definitely better, but there's still an Exchange group that has control over tier 0. But again, it's also something that you can remove, because in the same way as before, if you isolate your tier 0 asset and don't inherit permissions from the domain, then this risk is remediated. So summary, Exchange components with tier 0 control, there are these two groups that have like this direct control through these ACEs. And then there's these additional objects. So yeah, this additional group that has indirect control, and the Exchange servers and Exchange admins through their memberships. And should we classify these components as tier 0? I think the answer is yes, unless you do what we talked about, like protecting your tier 0, all your tier 0 users and groups against ACL inheritance from the domain. If you ask Microsoft, then Exchange is typically tier 0. They have an article that lists things that they typically classify as tier 0, and that includes these two groups that have this direct permissions. So yeah, I think it makes sense to, at least by default, to see them as tier 0. And even if you do implement this suggested protection against like your tier 0 assets, then they'll still be able to compromise all other groups and users of the organization. And having full control over the entire tier 1 is almost as bad as being able to compromise tier 0. So if I was a sysadmin or a defender, I would definitely try to do the same thing for tier 1 systems. There might be some accounts that Exchange need to have write access over in tier 1, but most of the things shouldn't be under the control of Exchange, in my opinion. But yeah, so Martin, what is your experience with Exchange and BloodHound Enterprise customers?
Yeah. Well, very often one of the first violations we see are Exchange having access on the MSOL account. There are also other accounts, but I think this one is maybe the most common. Yeah, again, we pull in a lot of stuff automatically as tier 0. So well, MSOL is one we do. You know, luckily things like domain admin, you know, they're protected from inheritance by default. I can see in the comments also from Jim Sakura that maybe the new MSOL accounts are protected from delegation.
Right.
But still, you know, customers, they're not starting their AD Connect adventure now. They started many years ago. So yeah, regarding if it's tier 0 or not, I have some customers who are trying to split it up, or who have done it, and some see it as tier 0. I have my personal opinion. I don't know. I think you're smarter, Jonas. I will leave it to you. Again, I'm one of those guys. I'm one of those people where I want to see the clean cut. I want to do all the remediation, no matter the cost. But
right,
customers they don't see it's not viable in a real environment.
Yeah, there's definitely some pushback typically from some customers. I know we also have some customers that have deployed the AD split model, and Exchange is still working. So it is definitely possible. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge, because if you deploy it could break stuff. So yeah, it takes some time to get it right. What about you, Lee? Have you any experience from the like offensive security perspective with Exchange?
Yeah, definitely. Over the years, we used it a lot in various attack paths. One story that comes to mind is I remember being on an assessment once where we sent in a phishing email, and as part of the phish, basically when they opened this document, it displayed an error message. That was just my intention then was to just get them to close out the document, and then my malware would be running on their machine. Well, they kept opening up the message over and over and seeing an error message, so they forwarded it on to a desktop admin saying, "Hey, I'm having trouble loading this." And then the desktop admin also opened the document, and in that case,
Nice.
I immediately got access to it was the equivalent of a tier 0 account, and it was through Exchange. So it was a very nice was very convenient for me as the attacker. I sent one fish and got two people's machines, and one of them was a admin over the entire network. But the whole reason I like to highlight that is because that one desktop admin, it wasn't like a server admin or anything, but due to this, I assume he had admin rights through Exchange because he needed to like set up new accounts and things like that. But because he had access to Exchange, that's what ultimately granted us such, that tier 0 access. So that was really nice. I would also say too, what are you going to say?
I was just saying like that was super cool. Like, yeah, and that's a good point. Like how like just having email enabled on an account can be, yeah, a security risk because you can receive emails and click on them. So it's definitely like increasing the attack surface of an account.
Yeah, and something else somebody else mentioned this, asked a question around how often do we still see on-prem Exchange? And while we don't see it as often anymore, the effects of Exchange being in environments is still there today. So when people installed Exchange, 20 years ago or whatever, it made a bunch of schema modifications, it modified permissions in Active Directory, and we still see those permissions present in modern environments. And so we still need to address them because they're there, even if Exchange, the actual systems aren't there anymore. So it's still an abusable attack path in many organizations.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think we have several customers where like these groups are actually empty, but yeah, they still exist. So even though that servers or like Exchange servers and Exchange admins are no longer members of these groups, they still have their privileges. So and that actually makes it a lot easier to remediate stuff and also protect these account or these groups potentially, because if there's no members, then there's not much to worry about when you're removing permissions or protecting them. So that makes things a lot easier.
That brings to mind just another like random thing I remembered was a few years back, James Forshaw released a vulnerability that he discovered that allows users to create, or computer objects to create arbitrary objects underneath their object in Active Directory. And that was due to a misconfiguration in the Exchange schema when it was installed in older versions of Exchange. And this schema change may have happened years and years ago, and Microsoft did release an update to fix this. But the problem is this was an update to Exchange, and so many people have already moved off of Exchange that unless you manually installed this patch, that schema change is still in your environment. So it's just another example of like there's these misconfigurations that maybe even these default groups and stuff are empty, but nonetheless those schema changes are still there and can affect your environment years and years later.
That's very interesting and unfortunate for these organizations that actually got rid of Exchange but still have like some of the permissions that are supposed to be fixed. It also reminds me that you could also think about like limiting the permissions of Exchange, like removing these permissions from the domain object and moving them to a specific OU for tier 2, for example. That's something I've heard at least being discussed. I think that is a bad idea because at least there's been a couple of times where Microsoft have released updates to Exchange that re-implemented the permissions on the domain head object. So, and of course you should patch your Exchange servers. That's like, I'm not saying you shouldn't do that, but it might mean when you do that these permissions are recreated, and then you're back to the same state again, and then you have to redelete these permissions and so on. I also think that Microsoft has something on the website stating that if you remove any of these permissions, then they will not help you if your Exchange is not working because you have screwed up with the system. So I think it's good to keep these permissions in place as long as you're using Exchange on-prem, and then just limit like ACL inheritance. But yeah, super cool story. Yeah.
I was going to say, I think that kind of speaks to something Martin was saying earlier about one of the big things about implementing, BloodHound or just security and Active Directory in general is sustaining that secure architecture that you're building. Because as you install new software or new patches, like you were saying, it may modify, this new software or whatever, these new patches may modify Active Directory in different ways that you may not be aware of. And so having something that's monitoring for those, breaches or those tier 0 violations is really important, because you may not realize that that's actually happening underneath. And so that's kind of one of the value propositions, is you're able to see that happen in real time when, new software gets added into Active Directory.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think we should probably move on, because we also have like ADCS, which is also a big topic to cover. So I'm gonna give it over back to you, Lee. So if you want to introduce us to ADCS. And
yeah, great. There we go. Yeah, so ADCS, Active Directory Certificate Services. This is a really fascinating topic to me. So if you're unfamiliar with what Active Directory Certificate Services are, it's Microsoft's public key infrastructure solution, so PKI. So PKI, what is it? Where is it used? It's used all over inside of networks. So probably the most widely understood use of it is through SSL and TLS certificates. So, the little lock that you see in your web browser, that's because a certificate has been issued for a website. But companies themselves can also issue certificates for like internal websites that they use or internal hosts. But in addition to SSL and TLS certificates, the PKI infrastructure is used in various other places. So for example, in email, it's used for signing certificates and identifying users. So Exchange has this actually like built into it. You can use it to sign code. So like you could sign an executable inside of your environment. And it's also used for authentication inside of Active Directory. So that's what's very interesting, especially to me as an attacker, if I could, somehow use PKI to log on as a user. And the thing about Active Directory Certificate Services is it's all configured inside of Active Directory. And so that's kind of what you're seeing here is inside of, this is the Active Directory configuration schema. So this is kind of what it looks like. There's a section in there that gets added called the public key services container. And that's where Active Directory Certificate Services stores all of its configuration data. So it's very tightly integrated with Active Directory and can really influence the security of the environment. It's also quite old. So ADCS, some of the first parts of ADCS were released back in Server 2000. And honestly, it hasn't changed a whole lot over the years. The functionalities kind of stayed the same. The interface has even mostly stayed the same. I like to equate ADCS as kind of like that old boiler, that old heater that you have in your basement. It's just been chugging along for years and years, and it works great, does its job, but you maybe should get some eyes on it, because there might be some problems with it. And sure enough, a few years back, my coworker Will Schroeder and I did some really great, did some research into Active Directory Certificate Services. And we released a big old white paper kind of detailing a bunch of the research findings that we found from this. Some of the most talked about things were a bunch of escalation techniques. So these are privilege escalation techniques that you can use to, potentially compromise Active Directory environments. So when we identified those with each kind of technique, we came out with 8 different escalation techniques, and we just identified them as escalation 1 through escalation 8. In addition to those, though, there's a lot of security impactful research as well. So persistence techniques, different ways attackers can maybe steal certificates inside of an environment or request new ones, as well as detection and remediation guidance as well. Since then, so that was several years ago, I kind of think of it as old news now. But since then, we've definitely seen ADCS be useful from an offensive perspective on many of our engagements. Like we've been able to compromise entire forests through this. That's one thing to recognize with ADCS is if you can abuse it, it's not just affecting a single domain, it affects the whole forest as a whole. So all domains inside of that. And so we've abused that several times on assessments to escalate our privileges. And unfortunately, because it is so prevalent elsewhere, many threat actors have also been able to abuse it as well. So it's really important to get eyes on it because it is so old and we have seen a lot of misconfigurations in ADCS over the years. Since we released this research, there's also been more techniques that have come out that we didn't identify originally. So great community, like the security community is really great, and they came out with new techniques. Jonas has identified several techniques and areas where we were just wrong in our research. So really, really great stuff. There's been some CVEs that have come out as well. That being said, not a whole lot has changed in ADCS. Like I said, it's not since 2000. There's been very little that's changed, and that's the same to this day. So how does it work? I'll throw it over to Jonas to kind of go over the components of it.
Yeah. So let's say you're a user in Active Directory, and you want a certificate. You can either be like a low privilege user or an admin, or even a service account or a server. If you need a certificate, then you will use a certificate template to obtain that certificate. And the certificate template will tell something about what this certificate that you are requesting can be used for. So as Lee mentioned, certificates can be used for code signing or for SSL encryption and also authentication. These kind of things, they are specified in the template. There's a whole lot more specified in the template, but you can think of it as like characteristics of the certificate and what it can be used for, and that kind of stuff. In order for you to be able to enroll in a certificate template, it needs to be published to an enterprise CA. And the enterprise CA represents the CA enrollment server or the CA computer. So there'll be a computer in Active Directory that hosts this enrollment service. So that's the computer you will reach out to and request the certificate to specify the certificate template. And then you say to the server, hey, can I get a certificate of this template here? For you to be able to use this certificate in the environment, it needs to be trusted. And the enterprise CA will be trusted by all the domain joined systems in the AD environment, but that's not actually enough. It also needs to chain up to a root CA for the environment. So the enterprise CA certificate is trusted as an intermediate CA on the Windows clients, and then there's this root CA object in Active Directory which have a certificate that's trusted as a root CA on all computers. And it needs to be a root CA that issues this enterprise CA certificate for this thing to work. And if those requirements are met, you can use the certificate. However, if you want to be able to authenticate with a certificate, first of all, the certificate template needs to enable that, but it also need to, whoops, I think I clicked too fast here. The enterprise CA certificate also needs to be in the NT auth store. And that's like, a fourth object in Active Directory, which holds like all the certificate enterprise CAs that are trusted for NT authentication. And if that's the case, then you can finally, authenticate with your certificate. There's also another object here called AIA CA. And I have to look in my notes to see that AIA stands for Authority Information Access, which tells you exactly nothing. But you can see there's like kind of a reference object that can also hold as a CA certificate. And it's also trusted as an intermediate CA by all the computers in the environment. So what you're seeing in some environments is that, they have configured this CA chain that goes from the enterprise CA through another CA, which could be another CA, intermediate CA, which is offline. So they've just like, instead of having the computer domain join to AD, they have just added the certificate. So it's offline intermediate CA, and then that chains up to the root CA certificate. The AACA objects can also enable cross certification. So that's like a concept where the PKI environment trusts another PKI environment, likely in another forest. So yeah, that's also something it can enable. All these objects here, they live in this public key services container, as Lee explained earlier. So that means they're just like simple AD objects, which have like a security descriptor, meaning that you can have permissions over these objects. And if you can have permissions, then admin's gonna delegate permissions over these objects, and that leads us into like how you can actually abuse ADCS. So I'm gonna give it back to Lee to talk about how ADCS can be abused.
Yeah, so this is just an example of one of the escalation techniques that we identified in some of our research. And I'll preface this by saying we didn't actually come up with this technique, but we did kind of surface it to the world. We learned it from somebody else, and we referenced that person in our paper and all of our work. But in this case, there's a certificate template that's published, and it has a misconfiguration that allows Alice, this user Alice, to basically, when they request a certificate from the enterprise CA, what Alice can do here is, because there's a misconfiguration, they can say when they're requesting the certificate, hey, I would like a certificate, but I want the subject to be for Bob, this other user over here. This could be an IT admin user. And what happens is, because of this misconfiguration, the CA will actually return a certificate for this user Bob. And what this allows me, now that I have a certificate, with the certificate, if you have ADCS installed and configured, you can then use that certificate to authenticate to Active Directory. So I'm going to ask the domain controller now in Active Directory to say, here's my certificate that I have. It belongs to Bob. And Active Directory will then return to me a Kerberos ticket for Bob. So now I can then use, as an attacker, I can then impersonate Bob. I can authenticate to resources inside of the network using this Kerberos ticket. So this is a very common, I would say, initially when we first released this research, it was extremely common to see this in organizations, and we still see it in environments on assessments. I don't know what kind of insights you guys have from the BloodHound Enterprise perspective, but we still see it in assessments today due to some bad advice from third-party vendors and even Microsoft itself on how to configure ADCS. So
yeah, maybe Martin, have you seen like escalation 1 in BloodHound Enterprise at some of your customers?
Oh, yes. I mean, you don't need to ask the question. I will say that escalation 1 can be a legitimate like configuration, as Lee said, right? But very often it's domain users, or it's domain computers, or it's authenticated users. It's a lot of vendors still recommend this to this day. You can find, it doesn't take long to Google, and you will find active documentation right now that says how to do this wrongly. So luckily we can find it. We're now aware of it.
Right. Yeah. So I think we have established that ADCS enables impersonation as anyone. There are the capabilities to do that. So yeah, and thereby also take over the control of tier 0. So the next question is then like, which of these like components are the key components to enable this kind of takeover? And also, are there any of these components that could potentially disrupt the operation of tier 0, and thereby also be classified as tier 0? And we can start with the CA computer. Is it possible to compromise tier 0 using that? I think Lee, you had a story about that.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely abused CA computers a lot on assessments. So it's a very common, like a lot of times there's tiering violations where maybe a server admin has access to an ADCS machine. And that's okay if it's a tier 0-1 admin, but a lot of times we just see that it's lower level admins who have access into these machines. So, which allows us, once we're on an ADCS machine or one of the CA computer machines, then we can, steal the private key of the CA and create our own certificates if we wanted, or just request certificates. So it's pretty bad.
Yeah. So I think in your white paper you talked about like that concept of like stealing the private key of the CA and then forging certificate as like being able to create golden certificates. And that's the terminology we have adopted in BloodHound, and I think also other people have talked about. So that's definitely possible. It does require that the CA certificate is trusted. So if the enterprise CA is not in the NT auth store, then it's not possible to craft a certificate that you could use for authentication. That said, you can still like create a certificate for any user in the environment. So you can use it to spoof the CEO of the company and potentially like sign emails or something. I'm not super much into like the tradecraft of spoofing emails, but you can still do a lot, I imagine, without being able to authenticate. But then there's also these permissions that the CA computer has on the enterprise CA service. So it can also approve denied requests, because like if you are admin on this host, you are CA admin. So yeah, you can do that, and you can modify pending requests. So that leaves some opportunity for compromising the environment. So you might not have like enrollment rights on an escalation 1 certificate template, but if you still attempt to enroll in it and you get denied, then you can log in and approve that request and obtain the certificate anyway. So definitely super powerful, and I think we can say that CA computers in general should be classified as tier 0. Then there are certificate templates. Martin, have you seen any abuses, or do you know if there's any way you can abuse control over certificate templates?
Oh, yes. Now you're challenging me. Escalation 4, I guess, or 3. I never remember which one is.
Yeah. So
this happens. This one is actually tied with escalation 1. Which one do we see most often?
It seems like it's also one of the more common escalation techniques to happen, because like I think we've seen a couple of times where delegated control over certificate template is granted to non-tier 0 principals. Sometimes even like some of the large default groups like authenticated users or domain users. But the idea is that when you have control over a certificate template, then you can potentially enable settings like the one that Lee described for escalation 1. So it's a way to enable an escalation attack path. And you can also grant yourself enrollment rights on the certificate template and so on. As before, it also it requires that the CA is trusted both by the NT auth store and it changes up to a root CA, and that the certificate template needs to be published to the enterprise CA. So you can say that like if a certificate template is not published, is it still something you can abuse? That's not the case, but control over a certificate template that's not published is, that's kind of pointless because you cannot use the certificate template for anything. So I think it's wise to just consider all certificate templates as tier 0, because if a certificate then is published, like taken into use, then that will be a tier 0 violation, and a way that an attacker could potentially compromise the environment. Then we have the root CA and NT auth store. And I've grouped these two here together. And that's because the combination of having control over both objects enables an escalation 5 attack, which is similar to escalation 4 in the sense that it's a way to enable another attack. In this case here, an attacker could add a root CA certificate that they have created to the root CA objects, and then also add it to the NT auth store. And that will make the certificate trusted in the environment. I said before that the enterprise CA also needs to be trusted in the environment for you to be able to authenticate. That is also the case, but if you create a certificate directly of a root CA, then there's no need for that requirement. So I'm not going to add any compromising prereqs here, because if you have this control, then you can basically just create certificates as anyone, and the environment will accept them. So that means that both the root CA and the NT auth store are security dependencies for tier 0, and should be treated that way. There's a bonus object for this one, and that is the cert publishers group. Andrea Perini reached out and requested that we added cert publishers to the tier 0 table. He wrote a super great blog post about how you can abuse the cert publishers group, which have generic all on the root CA object by default. It also has it on the AIA CA object and a couple of more ADCS objects. It does not have full control over the NT auth store by default, but it is a common misconfiguration that some people create. I have no idea why that happens, but in some environments, cert publishers do have control over the NT auth store as well. But just control over one of the security dependencies is also making that object tier 0. At last, we have the enterprise CA and the AIA CA. And there are some attack scenarios that could potentially enable a takeover. But I think it's also important to mention that like these objects can also be used for disrupting tier 0 operations, in the sense that if you delete any of these objects, then you break like the CA chain for the environment. And that means any tier 0 principals that are authenticating with, let's say, a smart card that is issued by one of these CAs, then that will no longer work. So having control over these objects are definitely also a tier 0 violation. So you should also classify those as tier 0 as I see it. So summary for ADCS. ADCS has tier 0 takeover control. We showed that with the escalation 1 scenario. And then there's many of these components of ADCS that are security dependencies for tier 0. So I think it's fair to recommend that you should treat ADCS more or less as a whole as tier 0, and don't delegate control to anything but tier 0 in ADCS. By default, there are no non-tier 0 principals that have control over ADCS. So you basically just have to keep it that way, and then you should be good. I think there are some scenarios. I talked to some folks that have like an enterprise CA which is not trusted by the NT auth store, and then they allow tier 1 admins to control that one. I think that is a viable setup, but again, like you can still create certificates for other purposes than authentication as anyone. So I would recommend not to go down that route unless you really have to. I think it's also a good idea to mention that like there could also be other PKI solutions out there. There probably is a lot of other PKI solutions out there. So if you're not using ADCS, you might have another solution that can enable the same kind of like techniques, and it's worth considering like looking into those and figure out whether or not, non-tier zero principles can control that.
I've personally seen some like PKI as a service providers out there, like cloud solutions or other companies that manage PKI for organizations. And that's great because they are experts in the area. But just keep in mind too that you've now moved tier zero from just ADCS to that company. So you have to make sure that you of course, can trust that company too to have tier zero access effectively.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think as long as you like have that kind of like trust in the environment, then it's something that's worth considering. Who can actually control that? Both like third parties, and also who are authorized to reach out to that third party and request certificates as anyone. So that's a good point. Anything you want to add before we wrap up this topic here? Cool. So last slide here is the tier zero table. I have updated the GitHub repo with the items that we have discussed today. So that's in there now. I have updated the look of the tier zero table here a bit. Thanks to Elad Shamir, my manager, for helping me use some AI chat thing to improve the look of this table just a little bit. We have like some engineers that are actually working on improving this table like a lot more and making it easier to actually use. But for now, you have to live with this like Excel kind of look of the table. But you can use that, and you can also export the CSV file and put it into whatever editor you prefer to use. But feel free to submit issues or pull requests for ideas for things that we should talk about, or we should correct, or do something about. That's it. Thank you everyone for listening in, and sorry for taking up at least like 18 minutes more than we expected. I hope there are some questions that we can answer now.
Yeah, so one question is related to what you just said. Is there anything else we should cover? There was a question from Christopher. If we can do tiering in Intune and intra-joint devices.
Ooh, that's an interesting topic.
They recently attempted to implement tier zero pause that are managed by Intune, and it's very difficult to prevent escalation to tier zero using scope groups /tags. So back to the cloud again.
I think that is really a good suggestion for another topic to take up. I know we have some people that are looking into some stuff with Intune. So maybe when they're done and like have a better picture of what's possible, then it could be something that we could dive into. Definitely a good suggestion.
Then there was a question regarding exchange permissions from Jim. If the tests that you made were using Exchange 2016 fresh installs, or if there were any installs with older versions, OSs, and then you upgraded. Sorry, just to last part of the question, because there's often a large gap on exchange permission ACEs in an environment that's based on the version currently in place and the one that was originally installed.
Yeah.
So 2016 or something else?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. Now I can see that somebody is tampering with my slides here. So I try to get like the chat open here as well on my side. But yeah, I wrote a blog post about like this approach we took and how we analyzed Exchange, and that was released earlier this year. And I think I deployed Exchange maybe around this time last year. So that was the latest version of Exchange at that point I installed. So and yeah, to my understanding, as Jim is also like saying that like if you have an older Exchange environment that you installed like 20 years ago or something like that, and then you upgrade over time, then it could be that some of these permissions are actually different. To my understanding, there was a patch in 19, I think, that cleaned up some of the worst permissions that Exchange had at the time. But still, for whatever reason, it seems like there are still environments where Exchange have even more compromising permissions that what we talked about today. And it's difficult to say whether or not it was like, it's due to the original Exchange installation that happened like so many years ago, and it just created a lot of compromising aces, or it could also be that an Exchange admin has like locally in their environment added more permissions. That could be the case. But yeah, good question.
Jim says the 2019 patch helped quite a bit, but it didn't address some of the very legacy Exchange groups that were used around Exchange 2000, 2003.
Right. Yeah, I think he's right about that. Jim is usually right about everything he says about Active Directory. Jim at Trimark, he knows his stuff. So I think Jim is right about that.
I think it speaks to just how old Active Directory is, and just how like there's a lot of things that are lurking in Active Directory from 20, 25 years ago that you may not be aware of. Exchange being one, ADCS being one, and just Active Directory permissions that were maybe installed years and years and years ago. So
that's so cool. But yeah, and that makes it interesting for us to look at as well. But yeah, thanks a lot, Jim, for sharing your knowledge as well. That looks like you just answered the last questions that were open. I finally figured out how to get the Q&A open. So
cool.
Yeah. Unless anyone has something else they want to ask, then I think we can round up. And if you have any questions, then reach out to us in the BloodHound Gang Slack. We are available there. You can also reach out to us on Twitter. And as I said earlier, submit things to the tier 0 table on GitHub. That's also a way to get in touch with us. We love to discuss with you different subjects and assets of Active Directory and Intern and so on. But thanks a lot, both Martin and Lee for joining, and all of you that has been following through the long webinar.
Thanks.